I na kraju današnjeg plenarnog dela programa obratit će nam se gospodin Donald McGettigan, šef misije Međunarodnog monetarnog fonda za Srbiju. Kao što znate, u toku realizacije trogodišnjeg stand-by aranžmana sa fondom, koji je potpisan krajem 2022. godine, postavljeni su ključni ciljevi koji se odnose na nastavak strukturnih reformi i realizaciju makroekonomske politike. I juče i danas imali smo prilike da čujemo pohvalne, ali i kritičke stavove o makroekonomskom stanju u Srbiji. Iz toga će biti vrlo interesantno da čujemo šta o dosadašnjim reformama, ali i u budućim planovima misli Međunarodni monetarni fond. Gospodine McGettigan, izvolite.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Madam Governor, Mr. Vlahovic, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. It's great to be here again. And today, what I'm going to do, in common with many other presentations I've seen so far, is to focus on growth, and in particular how we at the IMF and in the IMF Serbia team think about growth for Serbia going forward. Hang on. I was pressing the wrong button, sorry. Okay, so first I want to give a bit of the backdrop to how to think about growth in Serbia, give the global context. And here I just want to bring across a few points. First of all, world output last year, this year, and next year is expected to hover around 3%. This is substantially lower than the average growth we've seen over the last decade. So this is a very difficult backdrop in which Serbia has to grow. And the second chart on the right shows projections ahead, 5-year ahead projections of growth for the globe. And we project growth, the IMF projects growth of just 3% in 2028. Again, very low global growth. So in a word, if I were to describe the global growth context for Serbia trying to achieve strong growth, the global context is challenging. It's not going to help. So this brings us to Serbia itself and how we think about growth in Serbia. The first point I want to make is growth and growth alone is no good on its own. High growth for growth's sake is not our focus. The focus is on, instead of just a growth number, the focus is on healthy forms of growth. And we see 4 components to healthy growth. First of all, we want to see growth that's balanced. What's the point in having growth that fuels inflation, that runs up fiscal imbalances and drives up public debt? What's the point in having growth that fuels problems in the financial sector? Instead, growth should be balanced and be achieved alongside low inflation, good fiscal balances, a healthy financial sector. Growth has to be inclusive. It has to not just be for one part of society, it has to be right across society. Growth has to be green. It can't be destroying the environment. It has to be alongside an environment that has healthy environment, healthy water, healthy air, healthy land. And finally, growth must be sustainable over the medium, long, and very long term. In other words, potential growth must be high, and growth mustn't be exceeding potential growth. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on all 4 of these elements, starting with balanced growth. And in this first category, I'm pleased to say that Serbia is doing very well indeed. I would say that Serbia has what we would characterize as very balanced growth. If we look at external sustainability, just a few years back, Serbia was hit by a major energy shock. It's not only recovered from this shock, it now has reserves at record high levels. The current account deficit expanded, it's narrowed back again, FDI flows remain very high, reserves are at an all-time high. So balanced on the external side. Fiscal side, as Minister Mali said earlier, debt is below 60% of GDP. There's been a lot of good investment, a lot of good work done on the fiscal side. Debt is below 60% and it continues to fall. So again, good news on the fiscal side. The financial side, we see non-performing loans at all-time lows. This is a financial sector that we don't see any signs of stress at the moment. It appears to be in good health. And finally, inflation. Of course, inflation in Serbia, as in many other peers, was driven up by external shocks. But in response to good monetary policy, tighter monetary policy, and the fading effects of these shocks, inflation is coming down and is expected to get back to the target band by summer of this year. So on this score, the first out of the four, unbalanced, Serbia is ticking all the right check boxes. It's doing very well. On inclusivity, how is Serbia doing? Well, I want to look at this in a variety of ways. First of all, looking at the most basic way, which is severe material deprivation. What proportion of the population in Serbia suffers from severe material deprivation? And we can see by looking at Serbia in the middle of the left-hand chart, the rate of severe material deprivation has fallen dramatically. It's halved over just a few years, and that's good news on the inclusivity side. Similarly, on the right, we have what's so-called Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality. The higher this number is, the worse the inequality is. In Serbia, we've seen again over the past few years, the Gini coefficient has come down. There's further room for progress, but this is again a move in the right direction. Going within the country itself, in terms of the regions, we can see that there's big differences across the regions in the right-hand side chart between the richest and the poorest regions in terms of absolute poverty rates, with these poverty rates much lower in Belgrade than in the poorer regions. But even here, there's some signs of progress. If you look at the left-hand side, you look at the poorest region, the South and East Serbia, there's been progress and catch-up in this region relative to other regions. So again, I would say high inequality here on the regional side, but some signs of progress. Another angle of inclusivity is the labour market. How included are people? And I think it's fair to say that Serbia is doing well here. Unemployment is at an all-time low, and activity rates have increased an awful lot. And I'm going to talk about this later in the presentation. But it's still fair to say that there's some lagging behind the European Union in terms of employment rates, especially for females. And of course, youth unemployment rates, which we know that's a serious issue that continues to need to be addressed in Serbia. And finally, on the inclusion side, safety nets. Once you have poverty, how are these being addressed by social safety nets? We can see here that Serbia is not doing quite as well as other countries. In a typical year, the reduction in the risk of poverty because of transfers is not all that high. And 2021 is an exception, but that was where there was an awful lot of money being given out in a non-targeted way, so it was very costly from a fiscal viewpoint. And we can see from the right-hand chart, which shows the coverage of the poor by the social safety net and the impact of the social safety net on poverty, Serbia is in the middle of the pack. So room for progress on both these fronts. Then we turn to the third of four areas, green growth. How compatible is Serbia's growth with a healthy environment? If we look at the left-hand side, which looks at the share of renewable energy across three sectors, transport, electricity, and heating, and we can see that Serbia has made remarkable progress on both the electricity and heating side. On transport, less so. But certainly in these two areas, it's made good progress. But there's still work to be done. We can see on the right-hand side, this shows air pollution and the impact on health. And the higher the bar is, the worse the impact on health. And we can see here in Serbia, there is a worse impact than most other peer countries. So still good work being done in terms of renewable energy, still work to be done. We're firmly aware that there's lots of good reforms taking place in the energy sector. This is a difficult area, and we've worked very closely with the authorities on this with the 2-year standby program that's still in place. And as we can see from this chart, there's a variety of areas that need to be covered under energy reforms. Our standby arrangement, under our standby arrangement with the authorities, the authorities have undertaken formidable reforms on the energy side. The first step was to deal with tariffs. After the energy shock, tariffs for electricity and gas fell far short of costs, with major implications for the budget. These tariff increases, although difficult and not very popular, were dealt with. And now we're in the process of trying to make sure that there's a new gas pricing system and a new electricity supply pricing system for the non-regulated sectors going forward. And these good progress is being made on both these fronts. Then there's the electricity company itself. We saw all sorts of problems in the electricity company. This was converted, first step, to a joint stock company. We also, along with the authorities, there was progress on SOE legislation for all SOEs, trying to keep more of an arm's length between SOEs and government. And landmark legislation was passed in that respect. And as part of this legislation, and following on EPS being a joint stock company, EPS restructuring is taking place. This is not easy. It's going to be a long haul, but it's taking place, and there's serious reforms being undertaken as part of the program. And finally, the authorities clearly have a lot of investment to do, both in energy and elsewhere. And to this end, given that investment costs money, and it costs the budget money, they developed a prioritized energy investment plan to lay out what are the key priorities, how much will these plans cost, and that's also being put in place as part of the program. Which brings me to the final area, sustainable growth, potential growth. This is really critically important. And what I want to do first of all is to show you our projected growth in 2028 for Serbia and peers. And it's fair to say that we're relatively positive on Serbia growth. We see Serbia growth as a team under the IMF projections as being 4% in 2028. In fact, being 4% before this. But this is a point at which most countries are expected to be at their potential growth. So what this tells you is that we see Serbia's potential growth at 4% per year. So the first point to make is that this is much higher than higher or much higher than many other of its peers. The second point to make is that this just doesn't come out of thin air. It assumes that all the policies that were put in place before this program and during this program will remain in place, will not be undone, that the balanced economic growth and the really good monetary and fiscal policies will continue, and that the kind of structural reforms being undertaken will continue. EPS, energy sector, SOE legislation. So that 4% isn't a given, but it's our baseline based on stated policies of the government. Now, we believe that not only can this 4% be attained, but it's possible to go higher. And what I'd like to do for the remainder of the presentation is to just give you a sense of where we see this higher growth coming from. And to do this, we want to divide up growth into its three component parts. Labor, the amount of employment, not the quality of labor, we put that elsewhere. The amount of labor inputs, the hours worked, the amount of people working. Capital, the capital stock investment, that's the second of three. And then the third component, total factor productivity, which is where all sorts of improvements come in, including quality of labor, education, structural reforms, and so on. So I want to go through each of these three in turn and see what they mean for potential growth in Serbia going forward. The first point is on labor. Now again, this is quantity of labor, not quality of labor. We see that over the last decade, despite a falling population, despite a falling working age population, activity rates in Serbia have been going up substantially, which has more than offset the falling population. More people are participating in the labor force. Unemployment has come down. And this has meant that labor has actually contributed positively to growth over the last decade in a good way, despite the falling population. But if we look at the chart on the right-hand side, we can see that the activity rate in Serbia is already very high, and that under our baseline assumptions, we expect activity rate to be even higher, And we really don't see much scope for more than this going forward. So the major message on labour is very good work being done, but not much scope on the pure quantity of labour side to get growth higher. Capital. I think when people talk about capital, they speak mostly about gross investment and large gross investment and so on. But we have to also take on board depreciation. And it's investment minus depreciation that matters for the capital stock and for growth. And if we look at the left-hand side chart, we can see that the investment rate in Serbia has definitely contributed well to the capital stock. But a lot of that, like in other countries, have been offset by depreciation. And because of this, and because investment costs money, and because there's limits to how much investment can be done within a good budget, our view is that, again, capital is important, but the real driver for growth going forward is productivity. Using the existing labour and capital stock, building on them, and using them better. On the right-hand side, many people mention ICT as helpful, and it's played a major role. But the depreciation rate in ICT investment tends to be higher than elsewhere. But let's move now on to productivity, the key growth driver. And what we've done here is we've divided growth going back to 2010 into its three components. The contribution from labour is in grey, and we can see that in the past, since around mid-teens, there's been a high positive contribution from labour, apart from the last year or two, where it's been relatively low. As per my earlier discussion, we do not expect labour inputs, the quantity of labour, to play a large role in growth going forward. There just isn't the population growth to sustain this, and activity rates are already high. That's not to say education can't play a role, or training, but we see that feeding through to total factor productivity. We then go into the contribution from capital. I think investment is very important, and it's played an important role over the last couple of years. We see it playing a similarly sized role going forward, because there are costs and there are limits to how much investment can be done. But we're placing an awful lot of reliance on productivity. So you can see, in a way, our 4% projection is quite positive. In the past, this red bar has been negative, it's been positive, it's been highly positive, highly negative. It's very variable. We're projecting this to remain positive and high, even to get to the 4% baseline. So getting to the 4% requires tough reforms, requires macro stability. But what I want to show here is, how can we get this even higher? And here, I just want to draw out three particular areas. There's many other areas in which structural policies can help growth. But I want to look at governance and product market regulation. And the left-hand chart here shows, it's a World Governance Indicator, has many, many facets. You know, how effective the government is, the rule of law, etc., lots of different components. The higher the number, you'll see on the left it's Germany, on the right-hand side it's Serbia. This shows two things. One, that Serbia is relatively weaker on this index. Two, it shows that with reforms, it can actually grow stronger. And IMF research done in the WEO a few years ago suggests that reforms in this area can have a major positive impact on growth. Similarly for product market regulation, this time the higher means more restrictive product markets. Again, Serbia has a lot of room to improve here, but again, that can be seen in a positive light, that if there's progress made on product market regulation and freeing up the product market, there's scope to grow more. And same on the right-hand side, public ownership, very high in Serbia. If there's less public ownership, again, IMF research suggests, based on much data over many countries, that this will give tangible growth returns over several years. Now, what I want to do here is focus on our baseline projection and what would happen if Serbia moved all the way to the average of all the other countries I showed earlier for the governance and product market and state ownership charts, apart from Germany. So strip out Germany, go to the average of the other countries. If this were to be done, which is no small task, there's lots of reforms needed to do this, growth would not only remain at 4%, it would almost reach 5% for Serbia. Or if it reached halfway towards these countries, then growth would increase to maybe 4.5%. So these reforms, and IMF research has shown clearly, these reforms are difficult, they're hard. We hope to discuss them with the authorities during our programs, and a lot of the reforms are outside our area of expertise. They deliver, and they deliver growth over the medium term. And what does this mean? How can we put this in a historical context? Well, we can see that for Serbia and for the Baltics, the CEE, the SEE, there was massive convergence in the early 2000s. And that was relatively easy because it was a low base, there was lots of problems, convergence was quick. And then when convergence happened and there was less low-hanging fruit, I think convergence slowed. And we can see that in Serbia, it slowed quite a bit around the time of the global financial crisis, but it's rebounded since then. On the right-hand chart, what we show is these convergence rates under different scenarios. Again, as I say, we're never going to go back to the years of 2001 to 7. They were special circumstances. But our baseline, because of the excellent reforms being undertaken in this program, and we expect them to continue, we already expect a higher rate of convergence and higher growth than over the last 7 years since the mid-teens. If the product market and governance reforms were done to take Serbia to the average of the other countries in this sample, convergence would increase, the convergence rate would increase by at least a fifth. And that's just these two areas. There's many other areas of reform. We heard yesterday about transport, easing the trade barriers. We've heard about education. So all these are cumulative reforms that can add to growth rates. So in a way, I just want to conclude with the following messages. A pro-growth agenda shouldn't be just pro-growth. Headline growth really, if it's destroying the environment, if it's not balanced, it's no good in itself. If it's driving up public debt. We need growth that's healthy, growth that's balanced, sustainable from an environmental point of view, that includes everyone in society, and that one that's sustainable over time and that's compatible with a high potential growth rate. We've seen from the charts that although there's good progress made, there's ample room to make Serbia's growth greener and more inclusive. And we've also seen that there's improving governance, reforming the SOE sectors would significantly boost Serbia's growth potential, as would reforms in other areas mentioned by colleagues over the last couple of days, including education, trade, and so on. And these reform payoffs, although Serbia will continue to converge under the baseline, they would substantially increase the rate of convergence of Serbia and take years off the year in which Serbia would finally converge to the euro area in terms of income. Thank you very much again. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.